Let's go over solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. First, whenever you get a quadratic equation, that's an equation where the highest power of your variable is squared, you should always look to see if it factors. So let's take this example. 2x squared equals 6 minus x. So, this is a quadratic equation because of the equal sign, quadratic because the highest power on the variable is 2. And the way you solve any quadratic equation, even if you're going to use the quadratic formula, is to set it equal to 0. You could subtract 2x squared from both sides, but that makes your x squared term negative, and I think it's much easier to keep the x squared term positive. So I'm going to subtract 6 and I'm going to add x. I'm going to subtract 6 and I'm going to add x on both sides of the equal sign. I'm also going to write this in descending order. 2x squared plus x minus 6 equals 0. Now, I always try to factor first. It's easier, it's quicker, it helps me practice a skill I know I need. So I list the factors of 2, and I list the factors of 6. And I combine factors of 2 with factors of 6 in every possible combination, looking for a difference of 1. I've already seen it. 2 times 2 is 4. 1 times 3 is 3. 4 and 3 have a difference of 1x. So these numbers go first. I've got a 1x and a 2x. These numbers fill in these spaces here. This 2 has to multiply a 2, so I have to put a 2 here and a 3 here. This still equals 0. If this is a minus, I have a plus and a minus. I need a positive 4x and a negative 3x. So a negative here, a plus here. Now I go about solving this. I say x plus 2 equals 0. So x equals negative 2. I say 2x minus 3 equals 0. I add 3 to both sides. I get 2x equals 3. I divide by 2. I get x equals 3 halves. And there are my two solutions. X equals negative 2 or x equals 3 halves. Let's take that exact same problem, but this time we're going to solve using the quadratic formula. So you need to memorize the quadratic formula, and the quadratic formula says if you have an equation that looks like ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, then x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. If we take that exact same equation we just had, 2x squared equals 6 minus x. Your first step is set it equal to 0. And again, I think it's easier to keep this x squared term positive. So I start the same way. 2x squared plus x minus 6 equals 0. Now, you want partial credit on the exam or the next test? Identify what your variables are. A is the coefficient of x squared, that's 2. B is the coefficient of x, that's 1. And C is the constant, which is, in this case, negative 6. You don't have to rewrite it as plus a negative 6, but you need to see that in this problem, A, B, and C are all following a positive sign. So if one of them is after a minus or if one is negative, you need to make sure you put that into your formula. Now, if you know this formula and you have to memorize it, x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, that whole mess over 2a, you should start by writing x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2 times a. Back at the beginning of the year, I said if you ever have to substitute into a formula, into an equation, 4 letters, you should use parentheses. If you don't need them and you put them in, doesn't do any harm. If you need them and you don't put them in, you could get the wrong answer. So now I'm just going to fill in all of these parentheses with the variables that they are. The opposite of b, the opposite of 1, plus or minus the square root of b squared, 1 squared, minus 4 times a times c, minus 4 times 2 times negative 6, all over 2 times 2. Now, I don't have the ability to erase this, so I just want you to take a look at it, and now I'm going to simplify a little bit. The opposite of 1 is negative 1, plus or minus the square root of 1 squared is 1, minus 4 times 2 times negative 6 is actually plus 4 times 2 times positive 6. 8 times 6 is 48. That whole mess divided by 4. Good? Now we simplify inside the radical. What is 1 plus 48? You should have said 49. So what we have right now is x equals, and I'm going to erase all this, so I hope you have it written down. So now I have this, x equals negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 49 all divided by 4. That's equal to negative 1 plus or minus 7 all divided by 4. So now we just do the math here. Negative 1 plus 7 divided by 4. Negative 1 minus 7 divided by 4. Negative 1 plus 7 is 6. 6 divided by 4 is 3 halves. Or negative 1 minus 7 is negative 8. Negative 8 divided by 4 is negative 2. If you look at what we did earlier when we factored to solve, we got those two solutions. Now, the best thing about the quadratic formula is that it allows you to solve quadratics that don't factor. So I recommend that you always try to factor first. If something factors, I think it's much, much easier to solve it that way. But let's take an equation like this. 2z plus 4 equals 3z squared. Always make sure before you use the quadratic formula that you actually have a quadratic equation. We do in this case. Our variable is z, the highest power on z is a 2. How do you solve any quadratic equation? You start by setting it equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 2z and I'm going to subtract 4. I'm going to subtract 2z and subtract 4 from both sides. I end up getting 0 equals 3z squared minus 2z minus 4. Now, I'm going to try to factor this. I don't think it factors. 1 and 3, 1 and 4, 2 and 2. 1 times 1 is 1, 3 times 4 is 12, 12 and 1. Those don't subtract to 2. 3 times 1 is 3, 1 times 4 is 4, 3 and 4 don't subtract to 2. 3 times 2 is 6, 1 times 2 is 2, 6 and 2 don't subtract to 2. I don't have to try 3 with the other 2 and 1 with the other 2 because I get the same. So this doesn't factor. So I'm going to have to use the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula says if you have 3z squared minus 2z minus 4 equals 0. Write down your variables. This is what I want you to do. I want you to write a equals 3, b equals negative 2, c equals negative 4, and then I want you to write this formula down. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2 times a. You write those 4 things down on the exam, you're going to earn 4 points. You're not going to lose 4 points if you don't write them, But this allows me to point to, hey, look, this kid knows what they're doing. I can give them 4 points. Now we plug in those letters, these numbers, in for their respective letters and use parentheses. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, that whole mess, divided by 2 times a. Now we can write in what those letters are. A is 3. Well, here, we'll go in order. The opposite of b, the opposite of negative 2, plus or minus negative 2 squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2 times a. Hopefully you're seeing why I think it's so important to use parentheses, because you're going to get the opposite of a negative. Here you're going to get a negative squared, which will be positive. And then we're going to subtract a negative, which will turn into addition. So we get x equals the opposite of negative 2, that's 2, plus or minus the square root of negative 2 squared, that's 4, minus 4 times 3 times negative 4, that's plus 4 times 3 times 4. 4 times 3 is 12, 12 times 4, 48, all divided by 2 times 3, which is 6. I'm going to clean this up, write it over here, and then we'll simplify on the next screen. X equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 4 plus 48 is 52. 52 and then all that mess divided by 6. Notice that this whole thing is divided by 6. That'll be important when we try to simplify this. This is not completely simplified. We'll look at that in the next screen, because remember, we've got to check to see if there's any squares inside 52. So make sure you have all this written down, and I'm clearing it. So x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 52 all over 6. So we take the square root of 52 and we think about 52. Does 4 go into 52? 4 goes into 52 13 times. Why is 4 a good number to check? Because 4 is a square. So the square root of 52 is actually the square root of 4 times 13, which is 2 times the square root of 13. So x is equal to 2 plus or minus 2 root 13 all over 6. And look what we have in our numerator. If I group this numerator here and I look for things in common to these two terms, I see that I can pull out a 2. And if I pull out a 2, I'm left with 1 plus or minus root 13 all over 6. And now look, I have 2 times a number divided by 6. Well, 6 has a factor of 2, and that cancels there, and I get my final answer, 1 plus or minus the square root of 13, all divided by 3. There are two answers there. One answer is 1 plus root 13 over 3. The other answer is 1 minus root 13 over 3. If you wanted to know what those were, as a decimal approximation, you're going to have to use a calculator. But these, I think, are fine because they're exact answers. So that's it on how you use the quadratic formula to solve quadratic equations that don't factor. I'm going to do 2 more examples. You're welcome to try them on your own and then check to see. So the first example I'm going to try is 5x squared minus 4x equals 2. So, where's my marker here? All right. 5x squared minus 4x equals 2. Pause the video now if you want to try this on your own. First step, set this equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides to get 5x squared minus 4x minus 2 equals 0. Identify what the variables are. A is 5, B is negative 4, C is negative 2. Write down the quadratic formula. X equals the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2 times a. Replace the variables in the quadratic formula with the values they are for this particular equation. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, that whole mess, divided by 2 times a. I'm now going to plug in those numbers. So I would have the opposite of negative 4 plus or minus negative 4 squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2 times a. I now simplify what's in the formula there, and I get x equals the opposite of negative 4, which is 4, plus or minus the square root of negative 4 squared is 16, plus 5 times 4 is 20. 20 times negative 2 is negative 40. So plus 40, all divided by 10. Collecting like terms inside the radical, 4 plus or minus the square root of 56 divided by 10. If you get this far on the exam, you're going to lose a half a point because you've got to simplify. This is the correct answer, but it's like saying the answer is 5 over 10 when really the answer should be 1/2. So how do we simplify? We look at the radical. I'm running out of space, so I'll do this over here. 56. Well, 56 is 7 times 8, and 8 is 4 times 2, so this becomes 4 times 2 times 7. 4 is a square, but 2 and 7 aren't, so the square root of 56 is the square root of 7 times 8, which is the square root of 4 times 2 times 7, which is 2 root 14. So x is equal to 4 plus or minus 2 root 14 all over 10. Notice that the numerator has a common factor of 2, so I can rewrite this as 2 times 2 plus or minus root 14 and divide by 10, and I get the final answer, x equals, because this 2 cancels with a 2 down here, and so that's a 5, 2 plus or minus root 14 all over 5. That's a super hard one when you get these common factors in the numerator. That will cancel with a factor here. What too many kids will do will cancel a 2 here and a 2 here, and that's illegal. You have to cancel a 2 with everything in the numerator. So you've got to factor that 2 out to see what would really be left. And our last example that we will solve is a little more complicated, but same thing. Should work here. Let's do, here we go. Not a little more complicated. The same as everything else. So x squared plus 1 equals 5x. Set it equal to 0. X squared minus 5x plus 1 equals 0. Factors of 1 that add to 5, there are none. So a is equal to 1. If you can't see that, right, there's nothing there. It's like there's a 1. B is equal to negative 5. Let me clean that up, sorry. B is equal to, I'll just get rid of this. Sorry, I can't erase. B is equal to negative 5, and C is equal to 1. X is equal to the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. Replace those variables with what they are equal to. X is equal to the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C, that whole mess, divided by 2 times A. So putting these variables in, the opposite of negative 5 plus or minus negative 5 quantity squared minus 4 times A times C, all divided by 2 times A. That simplifies to x equals 5 plus or minus 25 minus 4 all over 2. And that becomes 5 plus or minus the square root of 21 over 2. And that was actually the easiest example we did. Square root of 21, that's 7 times 3. Those aren't squares, nothing gets to come out. Square root of 21 is already simplified. 5 is 5, 2 does not go into 5, 2 doesn't go into root 21. We're done. There's our final answer. I know this was a long video, but I wanted to give you lots of practice. Thanks for watching. 25-ish minutes is not too bad for homework. Have a great weekend. I will see you on Tuesday.